Right, welcome to the lightning round. This is a lightning round because we're going to have some really speedy presentations and to look at the new tools that are being developed on climate change. So thank you for joining us this morning. This is really because with the Paris Climate Agreement, that sets the framework for a transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy, which is a huge structural adjustment. So what we're looking at is up to $650 billion for each country maximum to make that transition happen. So what we're looking at is how do we develop the capacity, the tools, and the information that's needed for financial institutions to be part of that transition. So this is a huge area which UNIPFI is looking at, and of course many financial institutions are looking at how do they decarbonize their portfolios, what does it mean, how do they address the risks. So it's also bringing together more the adaptation to climate change impacts agenda, the adaptation for the transition to a low-carbon economy. So it's looking at mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions combined with the changes in water supplies that will come with climate change. The International Energy Agency has said that 15% of water use is for energy production. That's a huge amount. It's the second largest water user for sectors after agriculture. So they also will be looking at how much energy is used for water, because the water supply can use a lot of energy for pumping. So this is about the changes in water and energy, which we need to begin to understand what does that mean for different industries across portfolios, across lending and investment portfolios, and how do policies need to adjust to help the financial sector be part of that transition and really maximize the contribution they can make to this enormous transition that we're going to be undergoing. So we'll start with Yannick Motz from GIZ. He's the project manager on green finance. He will tell you about a tool that is being developed to help build capacity for banks to really get to grips with where the risks lie in their portfolios for drought, as there'll be more frequent and more severe droughts expected with climate change. So Yannick, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my presentation on environmental stress testing, a pilot project jointly implemented by the Natural Capital Finance Alliance, formerly Natural Capital Declaration, of which the secretariat is half with UNIPFI and the other half is with GCP. I was given 5 precious minutes to present to you the whole complexity of this project, and I would like to use parts of it to, first of all, thank UNIPFI for the invitation and the opportunity to do so. I'd like to start by showing you 2 pictures which depict quite well one of the key challenges our businesses and industries in various jurisdictions are facing today, which is water scarcity as a result of severe drought conditions. I think it's pretty obvious if you look at the 2004 Folsom Lake picture. California looks really nice. It's a lake full of water, and 10 years later, that very lake is obviously no longer in a position and able to provide the water or sufficient water for the industry and businesses in that area. Water, however, as we all know, is key and of pivotal importance for the success of industries and agricultural companies. So a significant reduction in the availability of water has a massive impact on the operational capabilities of industrial companies, but also agricultural companies in specific. So the companies banks provide loans to. That was the background, and the starting point and main goal of this project is to integrate environmental indicators into the financial decision-making processes of banks. So we decided to develop and test an analytical framework and model that will enable banks to evaluate the potential impact of drought scenarios on the performance of their corporate loan portfolios in general, but also on individual loans and companies. So basically, based on the information and the results deriving from the tool, banks will be in a better position to answer some of that questions. For example, I chose 3. One would be which loans and companies and sectors are in particular susceptible to droughts. A second one, and there is where it gets pretty interesting to banks, is the interest rate that we have or charge the company for loan appropriate, given that it is probably more susceptible to water scarcity than others. And lastly, as we all know, capital is the most expensive thing for banks. Do I have to take certain additional capital requirements into consideration as a result of a drought? So, but how does that work? The tool can be basically split into 3 parts or components. In the first step, we develop 5 different drought scenarios per target country. The target countries here are Brazil, China, Mexico, and the US. In that step, we develop those drought scenarios to simulate the potential impact of a drought on the availability of water, taking also the respective water infrastructure into consideration. The second part of the tool then is to translate the drought scenarios into a measurable impact on the company level. We do so by using 2 different models and frameworks. The one is called the macroeconomic model and framework, which is very similar to what banks already know from their standard stress testing procedures. And the second one, the vulnerability model and framework, is the really innovative part in this. And it measures basically the direct and indirect impact from a drought on the corporate loans or the corporate itself in, I think, 9 to 11 industries. So I'd like to briefly elaborate on the direct and indirect vulnerability model because, as I said, that's the innovative part of this tool. So the direct vulnerability segment basically includes effects on processes where water is essential for the operations of a company, meaning that a loss, for example, due to a loss will be caused due to water scarcity, droughts. A shortage of water will translate into, as I said, a negative impact on the company's functionality to generate revenues. So that's more or less the direct vulnerability impact, whereas the indirect vulnerability segment includes effects on processes where water has a sectoral impact, so to say. So, for example, if in areas where electricity is mainly produced by hydropower plants, a shortage in water will probably translate into an increase in electricity prices or even lead to blackouts, both with a negative impact again on the capability of a company to generate revenues or increase the operating costs. So a decrease in revenues and an increase in operating costs, as we all know, is not really a good precondition for a company to repay its loan. So the interim results of this part of the tool will then provide the user with the percentage change in revenues and in operating costs, so that these deltas will be applied in the next step to the financial statement of the company. The output, of course, as it is written on the bottom, is an updated financial statement, which will then, in a 3rd and 4th step, basically, be used to recalculate a credit rating and the probability of default. And together, that will then be used to calculate the loss given default of a company. Both basically will then be used in a formula to provide the bank that uses that tool with the expected losses coming from a drought. So I think it's also quite important to mention that we're still in the process of developing this tool. And the way it is designed right now, and that is something that we received as a feedback from our partnering banks, is that in the process of calculating all these new financial ratios and to integrate the impact, all interim results and values will be saved in the database so that a bank can enter that process at any stage, use the value that they find suitable, and feed it into their own methodologies and calculation systems. Lastly, and then I'm done, is I think it's important to see who's involved in this tool. We have the research team, which is composed of RMS, the global leader in risk modeling, and it builds a consortium together with Oxford and Cambridge University. The 2 universities are focusing on the macroeconomic model. And then this is, I think, also something quite unique in terms of project structure. We have partnering banks that receive the beta versions of the tool. They provide us with feedback on what to adjust, which part of the tool needs to be designed in what way so that it perfectly fits into their own systems. And of course, when it comes to determine, for example, certain variables and with regards to the macroeconomic reverberations of the tool, etc. But since the whole risk modeling is not something that banks are really focusing on at the moment. They do increasingly, also through this tool, but the insurance sector is quite advanced in that area. So we made sure that with the expert council, we also include other sectors and other perspectives on such a tool development. In that case, we have, for example, data providers. We have rating agencies involved. We have the UNEP inquiry involved. We also have reinsurance people involved, and we also have from UNEP of I, Bridge Bakani from the insurance sector involved. Lastly, this tool goes beyond putting a price tag on risks. It also should be used for of banks to start a conversation with the companies they provide loans to create a certain sensitivity so that companies ultimately will invest in sustainable and greener technologies. I think that I would like to leave it like that, and thank you lastly for your attention, and happy to take your questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Yannick. So a big part of doing this type of analysis is data, and having the right data and metrics is key, both for understanding portfolio risk, but also for understanding where financial institutions' portfolios are on the transition. So how are they contributing? Where are they on the pathway to a low-carbon economy? And so Rosemary Bissett from National Australia Bank will tell you what's been done to help develop some of the metrics on performance of portfolios.
Thank you. So this is going to be a hopefully very lightning tour through some of the work that's been done under what's called the Portfolio Carbon Initiative, which is an initiative from WRI, UNEP-FI, and now I'm going blank on the third one, the 2-Degree Investing Initiative. So we've been looking at, I'm apologising, I'm going to actually turn so I can make sure I'm on the right slide with you. 2 forms of performance metrics, or metrics that can help us understand what's happening in banking portfolios. This is responding to demands of investors, demands of internal management that are wanting to understand things like the answer to the question, are we transitioning in a 2-degree world? And so there's been 2 types of objectives that have been discussed in this work. One is the work around performance. So how are you performing? Are you helping the transition to a 2-degree scenario and keeping in line with the Paris Agreement's objective? And carbon risk. So what risks are sitting in your portfolio that may mean that you're actually looking at a future scenario where you could have losses coming out of your loan book if you're not tracking what that exposure's like. So, okay, it's building, sorry. That has led to 3 key areas of metrics that have been identified through the work of the initiative. So you've got some discussion and some work around financed emissions metrics. So actually looking at the emissions represented in loan portfolios through the lending so it's an indirect exposure. Sector-specific metrics, which to a large degree build on things like the emissions metrics, but actually take into account intensity. So you might be looking at something like tonnes of carbon per megawatt of energy use generated. How does your portfolio compare to somebody else's? Is it shifting over time when you're looking at your own portfolio? And then green-brown metrics, which pick up, are you lending to, for example, the coal mining sector, or are you lending to the renewable sector? Both of those are in the report that's going to come out at COP. So the report on bank metrics will be launched at COP, Remco? yes, as part of the Sustainable Innovation Forum. It's looking at 2 key assessment criteria. So is it practical? Some of the early discussions in the work, which has had a significant number of financial institutions participating, has said, if it's not practical, you can't implement it. It's not going to be a useful tool. And then the second criteria, is it meaningful? So is it actually directing decision making? So on finance emissions, and I've got to say, at some of the meetings that at least I attended, and I remember one in Washington, where it was quite a heated discussion about whether financed emissions is actually going to deliver meaningful decision making inside a financial institution. It's nice to know, but as you can see up here, the practicality is questionable sometimes, in that it's not always easy to get access to the information that you need to accurately represent the financed emissions that your book might be indirectly responsible for. It's hard to get accurate data from your clients, and a lot of the time people are relying on input-output models and generalisations to understand. You don't always know the total amount of finance that a financial institution will have, that a client will have for a project or for their business, and therefore you're trying to do significant estimation of what is your share of emissions. So in terms of meaningfulness, that then brings that into question. If you're using something that has fairly significant variation in or uncertainty in the calculation. But something like a project finance portfolio, the conclusion was if you can get accurate data from regulatory reporting and other forms of reporting by companies, then at that level, it's a smaller group of assets, and it's probably not so time-consuming to be able to get a picture of the financed emissions that you might have in your portfolio. However, there's some other drawbacks. One of them being it's what's happened in the past. It's not telling you anything about the future, which is where the tool that we just heard about comes in. It is helping you to start thinking about the future from an internal perspective within the bank. You're potentially taking regulated and unregulated sources of emissions when you're doing it, and so the quality of the data that you've got to rely on is questionable, as we said, and it's not necessarily taking into account other contributing factors that you might need to consider in the risk decision making that you have. In the green-brown metrics, which you're also, in the Australian banking context, all of our full year and half year investor packs is showing some of this. We're showing the proportions of our book in the mining sector, that's to coal mining. Stakeholders are particularly interested in this. And then we're actually showing the proportion of our book that's going to renewables power generation and coal-fired versus gas generation. So there's and I think that's an important thing to note, that a lot of the time, one of the limitations with the green metrics is people don't give you the reverse side. So you're getting a lopsided story. You need to actually have both green and brown to understand if there is transition. In terms of practicality, if it's using financial information that's standard and can draw from industry codes within a financial sector's systems, then it's actually quite easy to produce this information, both for management purposes in tracking what's happening in portfolios over time and for stakeholders. And the investment community are used to reading this sort of information when they're reading our results presentations. So it's fairly practical. However, there are some limitations. And one of them is that you can't necessarily get at a lower level down the sector breakdown that you need to be able to demonstrate the green versus the brown. The industry code systems that most banks will use, they're actually set up for the current economy or the brown economy. They don't necessarily have the subsectors in there that you need to actually track green economy in some areas. So that is a limitation of this, that I think we need the statistical organisations in our countries to start addressing so that we can start actually tagging that in our systems. So the meaningfulness of those metrics depends on the context and the situation in which they're used. So in summary, 3 key things. You want complete information if you can get it. And you want to actually make sure that you're demonstrating not just the greenness of what you're doing, but showing the full context of green versus brown if you're using the green-brown metrics, you need to actually put what you're doing in context, and your operating context, as well as a context in terms of where your information is drawn from. So being clear about the assumptions behind what you're doing is going to be very useful in forming the investment market. And then you do actually have to consider your share of emissions where you're in syndicated loans. And so there's some work there in terms of how you do that, and again, detailing the assumptions. That's it.
Thank you, Rosemary. So it's very important to have a two-way exchange. So as well as financial institutions responding to the policies, of course, for the policymakers to understand what is needed by the financial institutions to unlock those vast pools of capital to help with this. So I'll hand over to Remco Fischer, who is the program officer on climate change at UNEP-FI. He will tell you how we are helping to do that.
Thank you, Liesl. Thanks everyone for being here with us this morning. Remco Fischer, I'm responsible for the climate change portfolio at UNEP-FI. And UNEP-FI, as you all know and have come to know over the last 2 days, is all about mobilizing financial institutions to take action on climate change and on sustainability more broadly, through their influence, through their financing, and through their skills. And there's different theories of change here through which we work and through which we are aiming to achieve that mobilization. One is what Yannick was talking about, helping financial institutions understand the risks and opportunities from climate change and helping them make the necessary assessments internally to take action. We've done that through stress testing. The second theory of change here is getting financial institutions to account and report on the degree to which they are aligning their portfolios with the low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. Rosemary spoke about that. She spoke about the metrics that are needed for that. Okay. But there's a third theory of change here, which is especially applicable in developing countries where we need international public climate finance provided by bodies such as the Green Climate Fund and multilateral development banks, etc., to help mobilize private finance in those countries. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's one of the things that we do also at UNEP-FI. So in a nutshell, I think climate change can be described in many different ways, but at its core is a financial and investment problem. We need to redivert capital at grand scale from how it's flowing now to where we want it flowing in the future. And a couple of financing gaps have been identified. We need $1 trillion of additional USD per annum to decarbonize the global energy system. We need roughly 400 billion per annum to make sure that human-made infrastructures, so the dams and the roads and the ports of this world, are resilient to what will be the physical impacts of climate change, the meteorological, the hydrological impacts of climate change. And then we need another 50 billion roughly per year to make sure that our commodity production systems, our commodity supply chains, such as for soy, beef, and palm oil, are not contributing anymore to tropical deforestation. How much of that is flowing at the moment? Roughly one third. Roughly, the CPI, the Climate Policy Institute, calculates is roughly 400 billion, and from which half is from public sector sources and the other half is from private sector sources. So there's a huge gap that needs to be closed, and it's pretty clear, and everyone knows it, and even it's been acknowledged by the UN in various documents and fora, that a good chunk of that money, probably it's been estimated roughly 90% to 94%, will have to come ultimately from private sector sources. But the importance of private finance, and this is what we are discussing here in Dubai over the last 2 days, is not only, I don't think, about closing this gap. It's not only about saying we have a gap, there's not enough public money, we need private money, that's an easy solution, let's mobilize it. I don't think that's at the core of it. At the core of it is that this transition that we're all talking about, from where we're now to where we want to be, is an economic transition, and it will have to take place in the private sector. It's the private sector that where that transition will manifest. And the private sector just happens to run on private financing. So if we want to just have a discussion about how to finance climate investment, there's no way around looking at private financing. Now, in developed countries, that mobilization of private finance can happen fairly easily with domestic means. Developed countries have the public governance, the structural, technological means, as well as the maturity in the private sector to be facilitating that transition. But in developing countries, those means are very often not available. And they will rely much more heavily, or will rely heavily, on there being support from the international community and helping them put the means, the public and private means in place for the transition and for mobilizing private financing. And there's a whole ecosystem of organizations that are charged with this and have been charged with, or tasked rather, with supporting developing countries in their development for decades, and more recently in their low carbon and climate resilient development. There's a bilateral system, there's a multilateral system, and at the level of the UNFCCC, the climate change regime, there are financial vehicles such as the famous Green Climate Fund that was meant to be capitalized with 100 billion. The one we sent at 10 billion, but perhaps we'll see more in the future. So what do we see? And our aim, we want to inform those providers of public climate finance to disperse their public finance in the most catalytic ways. And the most catalytic ways to us is making available scarce public resources to mobilize greater resources of private climate finance. But the problem there is we've been observing that space for probably 10 years, especially at the level of the Green Climate Fund and the UNFCCC, and we just sense that there's a lack of nuance, a lack of understanding of how private financial markets actually work, what their nature is, what their diversity is. And if you don't have that understanding, you're not going to be able to put in place the instruments and approaches and facilities and mechanisms needed to mobilize private finance effectively. And that's something that we want to help address. We think as UNEP-FI we can do that quite well. What they are good at, the providers of public finance, is looking at all the different instruments that they can put in place, the guarantees, the junior co-financing, perhaps even a bit of risk insurance, the bundling, etc. What they're not so good at is providing nuance on what do we need, putting those instruments into the bigger picture of what do we need money for what, and what kinds of money do we need. That's a critical piece of the picture to be able to decide or choose the best possible approaches and instruments. If you don't know that, you're tapping blindly and you'll be quite ineffective. So as UNEP-FI, what we've done, we've come with an approach of informing that. And it starts by actually saying, what do you want finance for? It's not enough just saying mitigation of climate change or adaptation of climate change. You need to be more specific because there's such a diversity of different things that need to be financed. And what you want to achieve financing for, mobilizing financing for, will dictate what types of finance you will want to mobilize and will dictate what types of barriers you might want to remove through the instruments that you're putting in place. It's quite technical, so I'm hoping I'm making sense. So we've come out at UNEP-FI with an approach that we tried to brief climate negotiators on and the policy community more broadly on mobilizing private climate finance, which starts with, again, for what and where. And you can put for what and where, you can create categories of risk and scale. There's everything from high risk, large scale to low risk, small scale. Depending where you want financing to go to, the second question is, well, what kind of financing do you need for that? Because private finance ranges from microinsurance at one of the end of the spectrum, all the way up to infrastructure funds, funded through institutional investors, and SPVs funded through project finance providers on the other hand. And that's important. Only when you know that, what you need it for and what types of finance and who are the financial actors, can you actually have a discussion about barriers? What is keeping markets from being efficient and from putting capital where society wants it to go? And only at the end of that whole process can you then have an informed discussion as to the instruments. What instruments should the MDBs, the bilateral or cooperation bodies put in place? 2 more slides. Quick. Application. So I'll give you 2 examples of how that concept or that model works out. So if we apply, for instance, to large-scale on-grid renewable energy, you want to finance that. You're a developing country, you want to go in that direction. Well, we say, well, what you need for that is project finance. You could think about project bonds if you have the capability and if you want to tap into capital markets. Private equity might be a possibility, etc. You need to be talking to large banks. You need to be talking to project sponsors. And here you can talk about to institutional investors. What are the barriers? There's a couple of barriers that are very specific to large-scale renewable energy, such as they're not as profitable and viable as fossil fuel generation capacities. There's a couple of others. And then we can start talking about, well, how do you then mobilize private finance specifically from institutional investors, from large banks towards renewable energy? If you look at another thing, last slide, if you look at another thing, it's a whole different story. This is energy efficiency in operation and production processes. The types of financing that you need for that is not project finance, not institutional investment. You're not setting up SPVs necessarily. You're looking at corporate loans. You're looking at the own equity of the corporation that wants to implement energy efficiency. And the types of barriers are completely different. Here, you don't have a problem of technologies not being viable. Here you have psychological, behavioral problems of people wanting to make more revenue rather than reduce costs. And there being a lack of familiarity with energy efficiency concepts among financial institutions. So the interventions will also be quite different. I'm not going to go into them, I have no time, but you can download the work from our website. We're currently developing far more detailed work on this in specific areas of the climate change challenge, such as RED+ and adaptation. Thank you, and sorry for having taken long.
So the good thing is all the technologies are out there, it all exists, and it just needs to be mobilized through the work that we're doing, and of course that many others are doing in this space. So the thing about Lightning is that there's no time for questions afterwards, and so if you do have any, please do follow up with our speakers, and also myself, I'm Lise Sylvanast from UNIPFI. So I'd just like to thank all of you, and of course Remco, Rosemary, and Yannick. Thank you.